Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Douglas Fisher, Nancy Frey, and Nancy Akhavan on This is Balanced Literacy, grades K through 6. My name is Jeff Hahn, and I'll be facilitating the meeting tonight. If you have any questions for the presenters, please send them through the Zoom chat function. Not the Q&A function, but the chat function. Please send them when you think of them. We will answer as many questions as possible during the meeting, and the presenters will respond to your chat questions. Please note that all attendees can see each other's chats, and we will be monitoring the chat function during the entire meeting. Now what I'd like to do is go to the next slide. Upcoming webinars. September 19th, John Hattie, Know Thy Impact. September 23rd, Sugata Mitra, The End of Knowing. And October 7th, Trish Hatch, Data-Driven School Counseling and a Multi-Tiered System of Supports. So now what I'd like to do is turn the meeting over to my colleague, Lisa Ludicky, publisher and director at Corwin, to introduce today's presenters.
Jeff, there's a question about, is this going to be recorded for people to use later?
Yes, it will be recorded. People will receive access to the recording later in the week.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Doug Fisher and Nancy Frey are professors of educational leadership at San Diego State University and the founders and co-leaders of Health Sciences High and Middle College, an award-winning open enrollment public school in one of San Diego's most impoverished neighborhoods. Despite the fact that 70% of their students live in poverty and almost all speak a language other than English at home, they graduate 98% of their students, the majority of whom go directly into college or career. They are the recipients of numerous awards from groups like the National Reading Conference, the International Literacy Association, and the National Council of Teachers of English. Most recently, Doug was the recipient of the William S. Gray Citation of Merit from the International Literacy Association. They've collaborated on best-selling close and critical reading titles, rigorous reading, text-dependent questions K-5, and text complexity, and numerous other bestsellers, including the Teacher Clarity Playbook and Teaching Literacy in the Visible Learning Classroom K-5. Most recently, they collaborated with Nancy Akhavan on This is Balanced Literacy, which publishes tomorrow.
Yes.
Nancy Akhavan is an associate editor in the Department of Educational Leadership at Fresno State. She has held numerous positions as teacher, principal, and district office leader, and has led literacy programs for schools K-12. She currently consults with teachers as well as school and district leaders to implement effective reading and writing instruction and to close the achievement gap and increase reading achievement for all students. Nancy is the author of numerous professional books, including the best-selling Corwin titles, The Nonfiction Now Lesson Bank, and The Big Book of Literacy Tasks. Nancy and her husband, who is Persian, have raised their daughters in a bilingual and bicultural home environment. She appreciates seeing the world from multiple angles and enjoys their family's rich cultural traditions. Doug's going to start off the webinar today. Doug, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you. What we thought we would do is ask you to type in some thoughts around balanced literacy. What does that phrase mean to you? It's a super popular phrase in the elementary world. So what does that mean to you? Thank you, Heidi. Meeting the needs of all students while still challenging students. Balancing reading and writing instruction, Cheryl. Phonics and real books, foundational skills and deep comprehension. Thank you, Jan and Maria. Oral language reading and writing. Literacy across the subject areas and 4 domains, Alexandra. Mixing phonics, reading, authentic tasks, grouping structures, proficiency levels, gradual release of responsibility, 5 areas of reading. Look at all of your answers. This is incredible. I love it. Mixing teaching strategies, social, emotional, and academic rigor. Awesome, awesome, awesome. So this phrase gets used all the time. And everywhere we go, people are saying, we have a balanced literacy approach. We would say the same thing. But when we went to really look at it, the phrase was kind of ill-defined. So we looked at the history of this phrase, balanced literacy. As far as we can tell, the state superintendent in California, during what was called the reading wars, when we were having lots of conflict, said we needed a balanced approach between phonics and whole language. And there have been people writing about this for now several decades. It's now being attacked that balanced literacy is something bad. But balanced literacy at one point was the solution, that we had to include balance in our phonics instruction and, and making meaning from text. That's where the whole idea came from. Since then, it's kind of evolved and changed and grown. So we are trying to, and we hope we do, bring clarity to this phrase about balanced literacy and what it means for kindergarten through 6th grade students. Nancy?
Oh, thanks, Doug. It's important for us to think about the parts of our classroom and what's going on during balanced literacy. And one part of the balance is the type of text that we're putting in front of students. Recently, we've had a big push for having students read more informational texts, but we can't forget about literature and the things that students learn from reading stories, being involved deeply in literature. It's a balance between the literature and the informational text.
Another way to think about how it is that literacy can be balanced is in looking at the balance between direct instruction as well as dialogic instruction. You know, this has been one of those long-standing debates in education. Should there be direct instruction that provides students with explicit information about what it is that they're learning? On the other hand, if you go to the other extreme, it is a fully experiential, constructivist, inquiry-driven kind of a process. And at both of those extremes, students can suffer. When we talk about balance between direct instruction as well as dialogic instruction, we want to make sure that when it comes to being able to learn directly about some information, like, for example, the sound of the letter S, let's go ahead and make that direct instruction. Students really don't need to discover what the sound of S is. On the other hand, too, we want to make sure that there are lots of rich opportunities for students and their teacher to be able to be engaged in those give and take kinds of discussions where they can formulate much deeper learning. But direct instruction as well as dialogic instruction is another way in which we think about the balance of what it is that students experience.
Nancy?
So there is, excuse me, losing my voice already. There is a balance between reading and writing that's going on in a balanced literacy classroom. Sometimes people think balanced literacy and they're really equating it to the reading instruction that is going on. Different people call it different things. Recently I was with a teacher who was saying, I'm doing the daily 5. I had another teacher saying, I'm doing reading workshop. And I had another teacher describing it in a different way. But what is most important in a balanced literacy classroom is there is direct instruction and dialogic instruction going on in reading, and there's direct instruction and dialogic instruction going on in writing. Sometimes students are writing for the pure joy of writing, and other times in the balanced literacy classroom, they're writing about their reading. So they might be writing in response to what they read, which deepens their comprehension, helps them understand what the text is telling them, as well as what they can take from the text if it is a content area. And in addition, they learn the fluidity of writing by looking at what other writers are doing for them, almost as a mentor text. So in a balanced literacy classroom, we want a balance, a strong balance between reading and writing. And our greatest hope is that the writing fits into the reading. So perhaps if they're doing some writing on informational text, they may be doing a large amount of reading or research in the classroom at the same time.
And we could talk about a lot of other areas, including input and output, like speaking and listening. The last one we'll hit on in terms of balance is around whole class and small group. One or the other by itself is probably not going to result in the amazing learning that students need to do. We have to balance whole class lessons with small group, intentional, purposeful instruction. And as someone had said earlier in the chat, it's about gradual release of responsibility. We're being very intentional as we have students implement and assume more responsibility for their learning as teachers release that responsibility. To our thinking, gradual release of responsibility has 4 phases or 4 components in no particular order. These can occur in any order that makes sense for what students need to learn. And you can take this and take apart a phonics instructional lesson, a comprehension lesson, a fluency lesson, a writing lesson. You could do a whole thing just on writing introductions through a gradual release of responsibility. It's being thoughtful, purposeful, and intentional. And to our thinking, every single lesson has a chance or an opportunity or time where students are collaborating with their peers. So I'll start at that one, collaborative learning. And I hope you can imagine that a lesson might start with a collaborative task with students. Students might be talking to a partner, they might be jigsaw reading something, they might be having a collaborative conversation. But at some point in the lesson, students are making meaning in the presence of other people and using academic language. That effect size, as Sanja just put out there, the effect size of classroom discussion is 0.82, very powerful. And we should be building collaborative opportunities into our reading and writing, speaking and listening lessons. If I go up one, guided instruction, we're being very intentional and purposeful as we have students prompting and cueing and questioning. We're guiding their thinking, not telling them answers. That can occur whole class or small group. I think most of us are better at it when we do it in a small group. Most of us are not quite so good at it when we try to do guided instruction in a whole class environment. Sometimes it turns into individual helping. You find a student who doesn't understand something, you start prompting and cueing that student, and it turns into individual helping while the rest of the kids wait around for something. If I go to the top, focused instruction is where teachers are providing that explicit direct instruction, that they're providing input and modeling and demonstrations, and they're letting students know inside that teacher's mind how things work. Opening up our brains because thinking is invisible. We share our thinking with our students. So we're intentional in how we explain and guide. And lastly is independent, where students are practicing and applying what they've been taught. And both are important. You can't just apply things, you also need to practice to get faster and build automaticity. But you can't just practice, you also have to apply. And the tasks we give students individually or independently are balanced between the practice they need to do and the application they need to accomplish. Together, we think of this as that gradual release of responsibility, where we're intentionally releasing responsibility as students assume more responsibility. We decided to organize the book around this. It just made the most sense rather than having a phonics chapter, a fluency chapter, a comprehension chapter, fluency, all the different components, a writing chapter, an oral language chapter. We decided to organize it this way. We decided to say, what could we teach in a whole class lesson? What is good whole class instruction look like? What does small group instruction look like? What does collaborative learning look like? And what does independent learning look like? So that's how we've organized our thinking. And across them, what would phonics and phonemic awareness do? What would fluency, vocabulary, comprehension, writing, oral language? How do those play out in whole class, small group, collaborative, and then independent. So we'll highlight a few things here, and we'll have Nancy start with guided instruction.
Doug has given us a foundation for how it is that we might think about balanced literacy. And we've talked about a couple of those diametrically opposed components that we want to make sure that we achieve. And as he noted, one element of that is in balancing the kinds of instructional experiences that students have. Guided instruction is an essential part of this, and certainly a key tool that elementary teachers utilize when teaching around reading, writing, speaking, listening, and viewing. Guided instruction simply means this: there are times whenever students in the company of their teacher in a small group are receiving scaffolds as needed that are around robust questions, prompts, and cues. And it requires that teachers are listening closely to what it is that students are formulating and wondering about and making predictions about. In other words, what the teacher's job is during guided instruction is to rapidly hypothesize what it is that that student knows and doesn't know at that moment in time that would lead him or her to that response. And the use of questions, prompts, and cues can scaffold students in being able to do that. One aspect that we think of with guided instruction is in making sure that our grouping practices are reflective of what it is that we know works and does not work in instruction. John Hattie's work has certainly demonstrated through his mega-meta analyses that cleaving to an idea of ability grouping or tracking of students has a very low effect size, an effect size of 0.12, which isn't going to get much traction for students. And what we have to be careful of is that students aren't always in that same group. In fact, most elementary schools long ago abandoned the idea that students would spend the entire day in a classroom only with people that were near their achievement levels as well. Something else that we know from John Hattie is that when students have experiences with small group learning in the company of their teachers, that the effect size increases quite a bit. But I think it's really key that we think about the fact that they should be in the company of their teacher for some of those experiences so that the teacher can scaffold, so that the teacher can listen closely and give them just enough of a cue in order to get the student to do the cognitive and the metacognitive work. Now, grouping students for reading and writing instruction in small group can really be a challenge. And in fact, what can often happen is that students end up spending all of their small group time only in the company of other students who are achieving at typical levels or levels that are similar to one another. What we've really done, what we've looked at over the years and have utilized in classrooms is a rotation model that has a more sophisticated approach to it. So, for example, think about this, that during one rotation, there is a group of students who are homogeneously grouped. You can see them in the center of your screen there, you know, those kind of bluish green looking kids. And they are meant to represent students who have similar needs, that they've been pulled together in order to be able to meet with the teacher. But notice that the other groups that are in the classroom consist of students who have a variety of experiences, achievement levels, and so on. In other words, the groups that are away from the teacher are heterogeneous in nature. Now, as we go through the second rotation, for example, now what the teacher is doing is pulling out of those heterogeneous groups for a temporarily formed needs-based teacher-directed guided instruction. Those pink kids go back to their groups, and in the third rotation, those kind of mustard-colored students are now a homogeneous group, a temporarily formed flexible group, students that have similar kinds of needs. And again, in the fourth rotation, students are once again pulled together. In other words, what's happening in those heterogeneous groups, those student-directed small groups, is that there are these nice heterogeneous groups that are pulled together that are temporarily interrupted by some teacher-directed guided instruction for students to do. Now, there are some things to pay attention to. We want to make sure that the work that students are doing in those heterogeneous groups is not the kind of work such that if a student is away from that group, he's going to miss some really important experiences. Those heterogeneous groups in particular are times when students are practicing and extending things that they have already learned about. What some teachers will do is they'll have one day a week when students are actually doing a bit of catch up with their groups as well.
In other words, we don't group students just because they have an assessment score. Your DRA 44, your F&PL, your Lexile 650 is not how you group students. Instead, we group them based on what we still need to teach them. When the teacher knows what the kid still needs to learn, learning goes up. So those kids that are with the teacher, that teacher has to know what is it that that group of students needs to learn. Now in this quick visual that took a long time to make, so you should all be oohing and awing on Nancy's skills and moving these little things around. The misnomer is that every kid gets the same dose. And we couldn't figure out visually how to do this differently. But there are kids who need multiple doses in a given day, and a kid on a given day might not need a dose of small group instruction. So it's different interventions, different supports for different needs, based on the assessment data we have from students, not based on a score.
Which brings us to the experiences that students typically have in that teacher-directed instruction. And let's talk about reading instruction in particular. A question that we really have to think about is during that golden time when a teacher has a small group of students that are together, do we want the teacher to be doing the work or do we want the text to be able to do the work? And we know that for younger students, for those emergent readers who are just learning how to break the code, that fine gradient of text can be a really useful tool for them to utilize. But we also have to be careful too that especially as students move from those emergent stages, those emergent phases of learning how to read, that they are continually challenged and that they are engaged with text that is more challenging to them. As Doug noted, being able to equate a reader to a level, a DRA level 44, for example, and to imagine or pretend that that tells you everything that you know about that reader is misguided. And in fact, what we need to be sure of, especially for students as they move through the grades, is that the text that they are working with or the text that they are composing when it's guided writing instruction is sufficiently challenging. After all, it's the teacher that's there. Al Tatum, who spends his research life looking at the progress and the barriers for African American students, has a quote that all of us have really embraced over the years, and that is that leveled text can lead to leveled lives. We can never forget how important it is that students gain the knowledge that they need, especially as they move beyond that emergent phase of reading and writing. That knowledge is actually what propels them that much further ahead. So for instance, pulling together a group of students for needs-based instruction may very well be because they need some foundational background knowledge that's built up, not because they're at a particular reading level, but much more nuanced than that because these students have a gap in their knowledge. Propelling them toward that gap in their knowledge and closing that gap, that's what's going to accelerate their learning.
Someone asked about an elaboration on what Nancy's saying from Al Tatum's quote. He was looking with older kids, you know, 5th graders and 8th graders, and said, if they spend all their time in level text, they're still in level text and their lives aren't any different. They're not being challenged, and the text is doing all the work. The teacher's not scaffolding, guiding, thinking, prompting, cueing, etc. So their recommendation is, with older kids, we got to raise the rigor of the text when the teacher is there to do it. In the primary grades, the needs of the text are based on where kids are in their development. So we're more comfortable with more evidence around primary grade text and the gradients therein. So in essence, when we did our review, when we're looking for this, primary grade texts are selected for different reasons. Nancy?
So we can select text based on what students, are able to do. So text might be easily decodable, vocabulary is controlled. The texts are also predictable. Many times in primary grade selection text, the texts follow a pattern and the students are using their sight words to read the text, to read the sentence, and then there might be a different word at the end of the sentence that connects to the picture. So they're predictable in this way. Another thing that's going on in primary grade selection text is that they're easily decodable. So as students are learning their phonics skills, they're able to apply those phonics skills in their reading and decode words. So they're using a combination of sight words, vocabulary that they've been previously exposed to, and the predictable text and nature of the sentences, and using the text features to support them, that they're able to read this. So we don't really need to focus on, oh, you're a level A reader, you're a level B reader, you're a level G reader. What we need to focus on is the strategies that I would use to figure out unknown words. So I could bring together a small group of students that might be reading at different levels, even in primary grade selection text. And we might all be working on the same strategy, which is, how am I going to figure out what this word is? Can I figure it out by looking at the first sound? Can I figure it out by checking the picture or the other graphics? We focus on teaching the strategy. Doug?
And when kids get older, the texts need to become increasingly complex, so the teacher has things to scaffold in the text. A 6th grader who's reading at the 3rd grade level, who only sees 3rd grade text, will be a 7th grader who's good for 4th grade. At some point, we have to push higher into that. Now, I didn't say a 6th grade reader has to struggle through only 6th grade text, but if we never challenge them, if we never push their thinking with increasingly complex texts, they're never going to get there. So I think we've made a mistake in grouping kids based on our perception of their reading performance, rather than grouping students based on what it is they need to learn next. So as Nancy was saying, in the primary grades, if you're ready for this next vowel sound, if you're ready for this next digraph, if you're ready, we should be teaching you that. If you're ready and you're doing all this blending now, but you don't have it all coming together, but you're practicing this, those are the texts I'm going to select for you with kids that need that from me right now. So we're hoping that starting in grade 3, we're seeing more complex texts with the teacher there to scaffold. But as several of you have been commenting on, we have to also think about independent. What students do reading and writing independent. How do we get them to do independent reading? Because reading volume still matters. We've got to get the appropriate volume for students up there. So I'm going to show you some numbers. These are some averages. Some of you have seen these numbers before. They are correlational numbers, not causation. And there is some discussion about which is the relationship. Is it which direction? For those of you who are interested in more on a lit review on primary grades versus upper grades and level text, Tim Shanahan in his blog last year did a very nice review on the lack of evidence for leveled text with older readers. So I'll point to that reference or that resource if you all want it. But independent reading, there seems to be some relationship between the kids who read 20 minutes a day outside of school. They read about 1.8 million words, and the correlation is they score in the 90th percentile. So where is the direction? If reading a lot gets them practice, etc., or is it that kids who read a lot naturally do better and they want to read? But there's a relationship there. There's some interesting relationship between how much you read outside of school and how well you do on measures of standardized tests. Students B reads on average 5 minutes a day outside of school. The volume drops to 282,000 words, and the student scores in the 50th percentile. Interestingly, student A and student B could be in the same class. It's a practice effect. So I'm struggling, I'm thinking a lot about this right now. We're spending so much time on instruction, but are we ensuring that students engage in sufficient practice? Because students who practice more actually get good at things. Students who practice less don't do as well. So student C, the volume drops to 1 minute a day. The volume drops to 8,000 words read in the entire year, and the student scores in the bottom 10 percentile. So there is something around the volume of reading that students are doing. And I can make the same case for writing. Causing writing, assigning writing's not teaching writing. And students need to practice writing if they're ever gonna get good at it. Personally, I'll tell you, if it goes a couple weeks, if I got other stuff to do and I haven't been writing, when I sit down to write again, it's clunky at first. And I'm a person who writes a lot, but it's building that stamina, that perseverance, that grit with it, the practice. So every time I talked about these three, the A, B, and C students, I said outside of school. And I think in a large part, we have given up the fight to get students to read outside of the school days. And I have no problem with kids reading during school. I think it's a great center activity. So when you looked back at Nancy's group 1, group 2, group 3, group 4, whatever, independent reading could certainly be part of that. And I have no problem with that. I just worry that we've given up the fight to get kids to read at home, to engage in sufficient practice outside of the school day. And so we did a review a year and a half ago. Nancy and I did a review, and there seems to be 4 things that raise the volume of reading for students outside of the school. The first is access. Do students have access to things to read? So if you go home to your apartment and there's nothing to read there, even if you wanted to read, you couldn't, because there's nothing there. But access alone, or as some people have called them, book floods alone don't raise the volume. It's true they need access. Second, for at-home reading to increase, students need choice. They need some amount of control and choice over what they are reading. That can be free choice, or that can be constrained choice. You know, here are 20 titles on this topic. You can pick anything off of the 20 list of the topic we're reading about. Some amount of choice is likely to increase volume. And there are a number of studies on that. Third, students want to talk about what they are reading at school, even if they read at home. They want to be talking, just like all the rest of us. We like to be talking about what we're reading. We don't necessarily want to write book reports, although some of us like to write Amazon reviews, but we don't want to just write a book report. We want to tell other people about the things we're reading. I think that's why book clubs and literature circles and Save the Last Word for Me, all those protocols work because they get students talking about things at school that they are reading at home. And the last piece of research on raising volume at home is teacher book talks. Standing up in front of kids and recommending 5 books or so a day. If you're the kind of reader who likes this book, here's a book for you. And just teacher recommendations and book talks and giving them choice and giving them access and letting them talk about it has the potential to raise the volume of reading that students do at home. So I hope as you explore independent reading and independent writing, we don't limit it to what happens in the school day, that we attempt to take reading and writing home and build some stamina and some habits with our students. I know most of us here are focused on elementary, So I thought I'd show one high school picture of what a teacher was doing. And just to get kids to talk about books, just to get kids to want to read books, just to get kids engaged with books. We can do this. When we talk about volume of reading at home, again, in the primary grades, they have to be things kids can read, whether they are decodable books with patterns that are decodable, whether they're vocabulary controlled like sight words and those kinds of things, or whether they're predictable pattern books. Kids want to take those books home and read them and engage in them and reread them and tell their families and friends about them and go back and forth with those books. As kids get older, the texts have to become increasingly complex. So again, choice plays a role, book clubs, inquiry projects, those kinds of things to invite older readers into the text that we want them to be reading. This is what gets kids reading. A community of readers who are engaged and interested and wanting to talk. That's where the instruction can stick. So I'll say that again, I'm struggling with this. All the things we're teaching, whether it's a phonics lesson, a fluency lesson, a comprehension lesson, question about whether or not we can teach comprehension strategies, I'm well aware of that. Whatever lesson we're doing, if kids don't practice it, will they ever become proficient? I think we need to better tie, better relate, better collaborate with the role that instruction and practice play in learning.
So let's talk for a little bit about what the instruction part looks like. I've seen many of you in the chat asking, well, when do we directly show them a strategy? How do we go about teaching a particular skill? Well, we're going to do that during the focused instruction part. It's the I do it phase of the model. It's where we're showing, modeling, it's where we're directly teaching. Now, I often see too much focused instruction or not enough focused instruction. Sometimes we get going and we forget that we need to release to the students. We forget to stop with just the direct instruction and release and let the students to get reading, get practicing, get writing. Other times I see us set up a wonderful activity for students, and then we haven't prefaced it with focused instruction to show them how to do something. We're going to take a look at the next slide. We're going to see a video where a teacher, whoops, thought that was the next slide. Sorry about that. I was wrong. Okay, right after this, we'll see a teacher really showing the student what to do. But first, let's take a pause and talk about the different types of ways we can provide focused instruction. So focused instruction includes direct instruction. I'm going to say that again. Direct instruction is part of a balanced literacy model. Now, I think direct instruction has gotten a bad rap through the years because sometimes people conjure up ideas of scripted programs or tightly controlled reading programs, but that's not what direct instruction is. Direct instruction is the time when the teacher is showing, modeling, guiding students on how to apply a strategy, how to use a skill, how to decode a word, how to go back and reread to enhance their comprehension. So one example of direct instruction is a mini lesson. A mini lesson is a short 15-minute or 20-minute lesson that we're doing to teach a reading strategy, a skill, or a writing strategy or skill. And it's during direct instruction that we would model what we want students to learn for themselves. Direct instruction is about students learning for themselves. We would focus on showing and engaging them in the thinking so that they're ready to try out the skill or strategy for themselves. We can also do some of this modeling through a think aloud. So I'm going to jump to the bottom of the slide and talk about think alouds, because I think think alouds move so beautifully with direct instruction when we think about our focus. Think alouds are important and effective ways for us to show students what's going on in our heads. We have to slow down and realize what's easy for us is not what's easy for students. thinking processes that are easy for us and that we engage in all the time are not what students are engaging in. They need us to show them our thinking processes. So through think alouds, by talking about what's going on in our head as we're reading, by stopping at the end of the sentence and saying, I'm now thinking this about the character or this about what might be happening next in the story, we're showing students what's happening in our head as they read. For a long time, I've worked with struggling readers or students that are still striving to read at a level that they're working toward. And I find that they just start with the first word and they just start reading. They don't think about what they're reading. They don't stop and ponder what they're reading. And oftentimes I find that they say that they never realized that they could do that they could never think while they're reading. So that's the key to doing think alouds, slowing our thinking down and letting students see what is happening in our head as we're reading. Another thing I think that is really important during focused instruction is read alouds. I have favorite read alouds. I have a lot of them, but one that comes to mind today is when I was teaching kindergarten years ago, I had a favorite read aloud that was Silly Sally by Audrey Wood. That book never failed to lift my spirits. But I would also use Silly Sally to teach, not just to engage my students. Using the text as an example, I could discuss the alliteration, how good it felt to say the words as I was reading them. I can also show how the book repeated and that there was a pattern in the book and that I could use that to help me with my reading. Last but not least, in focused instruction is shared reading. Shared reading, the biggest difference between a shared reading and a read aloud is that in a shared reading, all the students also can see the text or have a copy of the text. We would work through the text together. You might stop to discuss meaning of sentences and phrases. Also, you might stop to discuss vocabulary words that are tripping up the students, helping them try a strategy out to figure out that vocabulary word right then and there during the shared reading. As students grow older, I've often seen shared readings done as close readings. Reading a text multiple times and taking meaning from it through each reading. Doug, ready, next slide.
Next is the video.
Okay, there we go. Now you're gonna see what this teacher is doing.
One more time, ready? 2, harder, okay? 3, okay, chariot. Let's see. Chariot. Fighting set shot. Okay. Break it and shout. Ready? Go! One leg, okay? Ready? Go! This way. Okay, right leg. Ready? Go! No, right leg. Go! One more time. Forward. No, one more time. You're not gonna get your balance. Let's run. You break it. Fighting stance. Follow me. Ready? Go! One more time. Hit over here. No. No laughing. Ready? One more time. Go! One more time. Ready? Go! Wow! Okay, chariot. Chariot. Don't move. Hands up. Now you will have your white belt. Okay? Chariot, don't move. Or else I'm gonna get the white belt back. Chariot. King it. Wow. Congratulations, sir.
So the video is a great example of how direct instruction builds student learning and understanding of what they're supposed to do. That little boy really figured out what he was supposed to do by watching his teacher first. We also watched the teacher move into guided instruction where he was directly teaching still exactly what the student was doing and improving his skill till he could do it all by himself. So I just think that is a perfect example of direct instruction. I want to think a little bit more about what direct instruction really is. This is how we focus our instruction. When we value relevance in our lessons, we can help students get started with purposeful and authentic reading activities, which helps them grow as readers. So if they are reading something relevant to them, if they are working on something relevant to them, they're going to take it in, they're going to be more successful. Just like the little boy was doing in the video, it was relevant for him to succeed with that skill because he was going to earn his white belt. I think another thing that we talked about a lot with student independent reading and the fact that we need to get students focused on reading on their own. Key to this is students need voice and choice in the books that they're going to read. But we do that also in direct instruction. We bring in books and texts that have relevance for them, that may be around topics that they're interested in, or it could be on something that they're wanting to read with a partner. They may not always just be working on reading independently. So as I mentioned before, modeling is a critical step in our instruction. It's through modeling that students can see what the reading work really looks like in purposeful ways. So just like in the video, we saw the teacher model how the student was to use his forward movement in order to do the skill of breaking the little board, then the student was actually able to replicate exactly what the teacher was modeling. We need to do modeling all the time in our focused instruction. We need to do modeling in a very direct way to show students what they need to be doing when they're working with text. Sometimes I see teachers shying away from modeling, or they get involved in modeling for too long. So just remember, what we're talking about today is balance in our instruction. We want to balance between the I do time, the we do time, and the you do collaborative independent time. Part of direct instruction is also when we're checking for understanding. We need to make sure the learners are following along with it. We might be doing great modeling, but if they're not coming along with us, we're just modeling for ourselves. The student needs to check in, see, understand. You need to check in with them to make sure what you're doing makes sense, to make sure that they understand what it is that you're showing. I think some really great ways for checking for understanding is using collaborative learning activities. Even during a mini lesson, you might have students turn and talk to each other. You might have them write a note and then talk to a face partner or a shoulder partner about what it is that they understand that you're doing through your modeling and your lesson. Another piece of direct instruction is when we're guiding. So in the video, we also watched the instructor guide the student. First he modeled, then he guided. He was actually literally positioning the little boy's leg in the correct place, providing direct feedback to the student on what was going to work to help him be successful. So in direct instruction, we're making sure our lessons and our texts have relevance. We're modeling. We're checking for understanding in ways that engage students in the thinking and help them start to have ownership of the learning. And then we guide and provide direct feedback in the moment so that they can be successful. I loved the closure in the video that we were watching because they celebrated learning. Now, we can't always celebrate by giving a white belt, but we can certainly celebrate by having students revisit their goals either orally or in writing, like, hey, I met my goal, or hey, I worked on this and this really worked for me. All of these things help us get to independent learning. So we've been talking a lot about reading, and you might be thinking, well, what does the I do phase look like in writing? We can teach writing through a variety of methods, and we need to keep varying our instruction to keep students engaged and improving as writers. One way to teach writing is through shared writing. Often I've had teachers ask me, is shared writing direct instruction? Absolutely. You're modeling, you're providing examples, you're talking, you're bringing listening, speaking, reading, and writing together. So when we share write with students, we are sharing the composure of a piece, and we're writing together. Sometimes in shared writing, we might, I'm so sorry. Sometimes in shared writing, we might be coming up with an idea collaboratively with our students. We might be coming up with an idea based on a shared experience or a shared text that we've been working on together. And then we write together. I have seen older students involved in shared writing, and they're writing in Google Docs. And the beautiful thing about it is the teacher and the students are writing together toward a common purpose. Another part of working toward a common purpose in writing is the language experience approach. A language experience approach does work really well with younger writers. It is another way of bringing reading, writing, listening, and speaking together in an integrated way. In the language experience approach, students tell their stories and ideas to the teacher, who transcribes them. So the difference between the language experience approach and shared writing is that in the language experience approach, the teacher is the scribe, but in shared writing, sometimes the teacher is scribing, sometimes the students are transcribing. Also in the language experience approach, the stories are collaboratively produced, and then students get to reread their own writing. So there's a lot of celebration that's going on in the language experience approach as students get to reread the stories that they've actually written. Interactive writing was a strategy that I learned when I taught primary. Oh, Doug, I'm gonna have you go back real quick.
Yeah.
Go back. Thank you. Interactive writing, I'm going to talk more about it on the next slide, but I just want to mention it here because it is an activity that I used a lot when I was a primary school teacher, but I've later learned how well it works with older students. And I'm going to talk about that when we get to the next slide, as you can see. But for a minute, I want to talk about power writing. And I honestly have to tell you that I learned about power writing from Nancy Frey. I watched Nancy do power writing with the classroom, and it was absolutely amazing. Students were writing and wanting to write for longer periods of time as the time increased. So let me tell you a little bit about how power writing works. So in power writing, the teacher provides a prompt and directs students to write as much as you can, as well as you can. So for example, students might write for 1 minute, and once the time is up, then they're going to count the number of words they have written. You repeat that process 2 additional times with different prompts. So after that third cycle, you can get students involved in goal setting and progress monitoring. And this is where I saw the students come alive. They had been working on power writing with their teacher over some time, and when Nancy did the lesson with them, they were celebrating their successes on how many words they had gotten down on the page in the 30-second cycles. And power writing cycles don't have to be only 30 seconds. They can be a minute, they could be 2 minutes. You can vary it to keep students engaged and interested. Another thing that can happen during power writing is students can note their spelling and grammatical errors and start becoming self-aware, not only about how many words they're writing per minute, but how well they're spelling their words and any grammar that they're using that may be correct or incorrect in the sentences that they are composing. I think it's best for students to be doing power writing in notebooks so you and your students can see their growth over time. When they write on loose leaf, sometimes those pages get lost, and it's hard for students to mark their progress. So the last one on this slide that I haven't talked about is a write aloud. I often use write alouds during my direct instruction writing mini lessons. A write aloud is much like a think aloud, but instead of focusing on reading, of course, you're focusing on writing. You write in front of the students and you share your thought processes as you compose. Again, just like in reading, students don't always realize what is happening in our head as we compose text, and we need to write that down, we need to talk about that as we write down our story. I was in a classroom last week, and a teacher was like, I don't want to do a write aloud in front of the students. I'm too nervous. So I told her, write your story ahead of time, write it out on a sticky note. And then when you're doing the write aloud on the chart or on the whiteboard, you'll feel free to talk about what's going in your mind as you're composing and writing. Of course, her students didn't know she'd pre-written on a sticky note. That was just to help calm her nerves. Okay, Doug, I'm ready for the next slide. So I mentioned that we're going to take a deep dive and talk a little bit more in depth about interactive writing. I love interactive writing because you can use it with students of all ages, but it looks a little bit different at different ages. I think the beauty of interactive writing is the high level of student engagement that is part of the process. The students aren't just part of the process in interactive writing, they are the process in interactive writing. Interactive writing is another technique that brings together listening, speaking, reading, and writing, because you and your class will compose together a message or a piece that you're wanting to write about, and then you're going to decide how that's going to be written. Students take turns sharing the pen or doing the transcription of shared ideas. So older students literally probably may not be doing sharing the pen if they're working on a Google Doc, but they would be sharing the keyboard in essence. It is a highly collaborative form of focused instruction. So we would begin an interactive writing lesson with the shared experience the class has together. Often when I'm doing interactive writing, this is reading a literature piece or reading a nonfiction piece and forming a message that we have or a thought or an idea about the text that we just read. So I work with the students together to compose the message that they want to say regarding their shared experience with the text. And then they share the pen, or with the older students, share the keyboard to construct the text together. One part of constructing the text is planning the message with the students. The message needs to be fairly short, and the class needs to decide together what it's going to say. It's really important that you keep equity in the class regarding all the voices being heard, so that the same students aren't always composing that text and deciding on what's going to be said. But as the class is talking about the message, you can continue to refine the message out loud until you come to an agreement on what's going to be written. Then you can model for the student, not orally, you're going to talk about how many words might we be writing, how many sentences might we be writing. And then the students are going to come up to a chart paper or a whiteboard and compose that sentence. As I said, I've also seen students compose on Google Docs. I've seen a group of 7th graders. I don't know how many middle school teachers we have online today, but I've seen a group of 7th graders compose together using the app Pear Deck, and that was really exciting because as one was controlling the screen, the other students got to see what they were working on and having it shared out. So interactive writing isn't just for younger students. It does work well with older students. Just remember that you're going to have to start with a shared experience also. It could be a piece of literature, it could be a nonfiction text, but often with older students, I'll use a web quest or a scientific inquiry, and then they're going to decide on what it is that they're going to be writing about. Interactive writing with older students is more fluid. They can write sentences or paragraphs on their own. You're not simply working on writing a word or a sentence as you are with younger students. And with older students, the focus is to connect students' ideas about what to write to their plan for what they want to say, and then have them write it together. So that was a little bit of a deep dive on interactive writing, and a way for us who teach beyond the grades of kindergarten through 2nd to think about how we can use interactive writing in our daily practices in our focused instruction. Thanks, Doug.
The last area is collaborative learning. So we have to get kids working, talking, interacting, using language with one another. We think of collaborative learning in 2 ways, group work and productive group work. Both have interaction and academic language practice and development, but there are some differences. In group work, students are clarifying their beliefs, values, and ideas, whereas in productive group work, they're consolidating understanding and using argumentation skills. In group work, the goal is to share, whereas in productive group work, the goal is problem solving. And probably the biggest difference we see is in group work, there's no accountability or group accountability. And in productive group work, there's individual accountability. We are not saying group work is bad and productive group work is good. We use these at different times for different purposes. But in classrooms where there's no productive group work, students soon learn their teacher will never catch them if they don't do what they're supposed to be doing. Some of the common group work examples are things like turn to your partner and say this, do this, whatever. Think, pair, square, where they have a partner conversation and they square up with another partnership. A carousel where they walk around the room and talk about visual images. Novel ideas only, where they can only contribute new things to the conversation. Or opinion stations, where they have a strongly agree, disagree, and strongly disagree corner where they can go and talk. In addition, there are productive group work examples, like a conversation roundtable where students are taking notes on what other people say. Kagan strategy like numbered heads together, literature circles, reciprocal teaching, jigsaw, collaborative poster where students are given a color marker and they can only contribute to that poster in that color that they've been assigned, so they have individual accountability again. Again, the whole idea is to get students using language, they're reading and they're writing, speaking and listening as they interact with other people. And while they're doing that, some of the other kids are with their teacher in those needs-based groups based on the assessment data we have about them. We did a lot of questions. We hope we answered your questions while the chat was going on. We'll go back through this. Anything we didn't answer, we will make sure we send some stuff out. Jeff, you want to tell us about that?
Yes, we'll just make sure that you get a copy of the chat, go through that and take a look at the questions that need to still be answered, and you'll send those out and they'll come out when they receive their video at the towards the end of the week.
Thank you.
And I think now we want to turn it over to Lisa.
Yeah, just for a couple of minutes. If you're interested in this topic and you want to learn more, most of your questions will also be answered in This is Balanced Literacy, the book that's coming out tomorrow. And you can get that at Corwin or wherever you buy your professional books. Next slide. Also, we have 5 what we're calling on your feet guides for teachers that are on individual strategies that are addressed in the Balanced Literacy book. The first ones we've released, these are six panels, laminated cheat sheets, basically, to some of these very critical strategies that we've been talking about tonight. And they include some background information, how to assess, and also a short lesson on each of them, a model lesson. So the ones we have out now are shared reading, guided reading K2, a separate one for guided reading grades 3-5, interactive read aloud, and interactive writing. And we're going to be putting out more of these that are allow you to go into greater depth into these strategies that are in the Balanced Literacy book. We'll put out 3 more in January, 4 or 5 more out next summer on topics like independent reading, guided writing, independent writing, modeled writing, collaborative reading and writing, scaffolded writing instruction, which includes power writing, that and a strategy a lot of you are enthusiastic about tonight, and so forth. You can get those also on the Corwin website. And next slide, please. Can we see the next slide? Oh, there it is. I'm sorry. Okay, so we also have institutes that you can attend. This one on Balanced Literacy is in San Diego, California. It's all the authors will be there presenting, just like they were tonight, but it is a full 2-3 day event focused on Balanced Literacy. And you can get $50 off if you use that code. And you can start registering for that now. That's next June. Next slide, please. Oh, that's it. Okay. I just would add, I think there was a slide I missed, that they are also available. These authors are to come to your school and do workshops in your school district. Somebody's flipping. There it is. The workshops. These are the set workshops that go with Balanced Literacy, but we also can do anything that you want, customized coaching and implementation days, whatever your school needs around Balanced Literacy. We have Doug, Nancy, and a team of others who can bring those into your school. And you can look for those, more information about those workshops on our website. All right, thanks so much for attending tonight.